Good morning. Thank you all for being here this morning. We're going to go ahead and get started and let people come in as they may. This morning's panel is on President Eisenhower's legacy. We're going to have about an hour together. Each of the panelists will speak for somewhere roughly around 10 minutes, perhaps. We want to leave plenty of time for interaction with you all and take your questions as well. So I will introduce very generally the panelists from your right, my left, and then a brief introduction to the panel itself, and then I'll let each of the speakers take it in turn. So to your far right, my far left is Bruce Larson from the Political Science Department, Michael Birkner from the History Department, and Ann Douds from the Public Policy Program. I am Brendan Cushing-Daniels. I am in the Economics Department, and I currently hold the Harold G. Evans Chair of Eisenhower Leadership Studies through the Eisenhower Institute, through which I get to work with the Eisenhower Institute undergraduate fellows. It is my great pleasure to moderate this panel, so I will have a few words, and then I will just field the questions and help the panelists find out where they are and such things. So what can we learn from a new look at the legacy of President Eisenhower? I think for some of the panelists, the answer would be quite a lot, and for others, when we think about other aspects, perhaps in Congress, perhaps not so much. The contrast between President Eisenhower and really any occupant of the White House in the 21st century are stark, but so are the environments in which they operate, right? The relationship between the executive and the legislative branches has changed quite dramatically over that time as well. Politicians today are facing a 24-hour news cycle, constant social media. They have to have a presence. There are presences out there that are influencing them as well, and those are challenges that President Eisenhower did not face. So over the next hour or so, we're going to discuss the role of women in leadership on the eve of the Eisenhower presidency. We'll talk about the changes in the functioning and the output of Congress, and we're going to let Professor Birkner start with a broad overview, a general overview of President Eisenhower's legacy. So, Michael.
Thank you, Brendan. And it's great to see so many good Gettysburgians here, including many people who are as antediluvian as I am in terms of their connections with this college. It's just a nice moment for Gettysburg College, I think, and of course it's all centered around the inauguration of our new president. Look, the subject, let's stipulate, is textured, it's rich, it's layered, it's complex. That's what we call scholarship and history. We're going to touch on some key elements of Eisenhower and leadership, but by golly, there's so much more that we could talk about if we had all day, and we're hoping that some of you will bring up issues relating to leadership that are not touched upon in any of our presentations, and then we can have a little go at them as we have time. Let me just say here, that as it took time for American scholars to recognize that Dwight Eisenhower was in many ways the epitome of effective leadership. He did not have, in his own period of presidency, the kind of widespread positive recognition by pundits and by scholars, including leading scholars at such institutions as Harvard. I'm thinking of Richard Neustadt's book. And it took time for something to happen. Now, how can I prove that to you? Very simply. In 1962, we get the Schlesinger poll, which ranks Eisenhower 22nd out of 34 people who had served in the White House, which puts him in with mediocrities that really you would think are not Eisenhower's peers. 1990, things are starting to change. Eisenhower's moving up, about 20th. Today, C-SPAN's poll, you can check it out yourself. Eisenhower is ranked 5th among 44 presidents. It is probably the most dramatic movement we would ever see on the presidential stock exchange. And there we are. Now, I could give you my back and forth about whether he should be 5th or something else, but the point is that scholars have begun to appreciate why Eisenhower and the fact that Eisenhower was, in fact, effective as president. So what makes the case for this? I think you have to start out with some macro stuff, which is you've got 8 years in the White House in the 1950s, and over those 8 years, the gross national product goes up dramatically. The average American's standard of living is noticeably better. Just to give you one little tiny example, in 1950, about 48% of Americans owned a television. In 1960, 92% of Americans own a television. That's just the tip of a very large iceberg in terms of the quality of life that working Americans experienced during Eisenhower's presidency. Budgets were balanced 3 times during his presidency, and 5 other times they were very close to balanced. The United States was involved in no wars. Despite the fictional missile gap that was used against Richard Nixon in 1960, that Eisenhower had supposedly allowed to have happen, that missile gap disappeared the second day that John F. Kennedy was in the White House because there was no missile gap. The United States was stronger by every measure against its major adversary, the Soviet Union. And I could go on with a litany of accomplishments of that presidency. The most notable that you would recognize immediately would be the National Highway Act, because we all have benefited from that. But think about the National Defense Education Act. Some of you in this room, like me, were able to attend college because of the National Defense Education Act. Some went to grad school on that basis. You've got the first civil rights measure passed of any significance since Reconstruction. 2 new states enter the Union. You've got the Salk vaccine implemented for free for the entire country, the entire population. I'm one of the first people to get vaccinated. Maybe that's why I like Ike. Because I don't know if my parents would have paid the $15 to get it done. Now, let me segue, because I'm not going to talk about legislative accomplishments. That's Professor Larson's thing, right? The prevailing view of a leader is of a jet-jawed man on horseback, or a guy standing on a balcony posturing to cheering crowds below him. That wasn't Dwight Eisenhower, quite the opposite. Ike did not table pound, and he made it very clear that that wasn't the kind of leadership that worked. In some instances, he used what the Princeton political scientist Fred Greenstein called the hidden hand, which is to say a kind of manipulative approach where he didn't show his hand, but he had others do his bidding. He didn't do that consistently, and one of the things that's been misunderstood about the hidden hand is people assume that Eisenhower was completely a hidden hand presidency. He was president. He was not. When he saw an issue that he needed to take on head on, such as defense reorganization, foreign aid, other things, he was right out in the open fighting for what he wanted. The key about Eisenhower, I think, in terms of understanding successful leadership, is the concept of team building. I think that was his mantra first and last. And that includes 2 notable elements that I'll mention here. One of them is dealing with potential frictions within your own administration where people don't agree with one another about what you're supposed to do. And the other is how you deal with staff and how you keep the staff working in a positive frame of mind, doing their best for their country. And I think he is just absolutely at the top of the line when it comes to either of those things. So I'll illustrate the first point by telling you a story which I got from Elliot Richardson's memoirs. Elliot Richardson was a deputy attorney general toward the end of Eisenhower's presidency, and he wrote a memoir in which he describes going to a cabinet meeting around 1957 and the inevitably dicey issue of whether the United States is going to spend X amount of dollars on foreign aid in that particular fiscal year. And the Eisenhower Secretary of the Treasury was a very crusty Ohio conservative businessman by the name of George Humphrey. And he used to constantly use the word rathole, rathole, whenever he described foreign aid. So Eisenhower has the issue of foreign aid introduced. Humphrey starts his rathole, rathole thing. And then when he pauses for breath, Eisenhower, with an air of polite inquiry, says to him, "That's really interesting, George, but tell me this. If you were in charge, how would you raise the standard of living in India?" So Humphrey completely takes the bait. He starts talking about building infrastructure, financing rural development, expanding technical education, providing health care, prenatal health care. And when he pauses again, Eisenhower says, "Do you see a lot of difference, George, between what you're advocating and what we're trying to do with this foreign aid program?" Well, as you might guess, India got its financial aid. As for keeping morale high, I think you can illustrate this on many levels, but I'll give you one example that to me was kind of iconic. Eisenhower appointed a former general, Air Force general, named Elwood Quesada as his FAA chair in 1958, and he did a pretty good job. But one day, Quesada did something really dumb. He had attended a meeting, a very confidential meeting, about a new program that the administration was going to unveil in a few weeks or months once it was tweaked. And it happened that he ran into some reporters afterwards, and he blurted out what they were doing. And it was on the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times the next day. It was a bad move. Quesada was completely not only remorseful, but stricken because he felt this was a job-losing deal. So he writes his resignation. He asks Ann Whitman, Eisenhower's trustee secretary, for an appointment with the president the next day, and she gets it for him, and he makes his way into the Oval Office. As he's walking into the Eisenhower's office, Eisenhower rises, comes over to him, and he's about to hand Eisenhower the resignation letter, and Eisenhower says, hold on. He says, Elwood, I'm not taking this letter. Go back to work. You're doing a good job. I give everyone in my administration one blunder a year. You've done a beaut. He says, but that's your blunder. Go back to work. Now, you can imagine this guy would walk over hot coals for Eisenhower because of that kind of a response. No lecture, no rant, no resignation, no firing. That's Eisenhower. In terms of dealing with crises, Eisenhower represented calmness and rationality. And this is something that I really can't emphasize enough, that the temperament and personality of the person holding the Oval Office is exceedingly important in terms of our evaluating that person's effectiveness and indeed them being effective in the first place. And we could talk at length about this, but I'll simply quote one of Eisenhower's top aides, General Andrew Goodpaster, who referred to Eisenhower's strength and civility as a matter of always treating people as they should be treated, building relationships, not throwing darts at allies when it might be politically convenient, and always being civil with somebody. Eisenhower said something that we cannot prove. He claims that every time he would get really mad at a political figure, and you can name someone who crossed him. Margaret Chase Smith was someone who he was really mad at in 1959 when she cast a deciding vote against confirming a cabinet secretary named Louis Strauss. But what he claimed he did was instead of yelling about it or telling the press, he would write the person's name on a piece of paper and stuff it in a desk drawer. Now, of course, we can't confirm he did that, but he said he did that. Now, I only have a minute left because I want to turn this to my colleagues, but I want to also emphasize something here. Historians are not about hagiography. And as much as I respect and admire Eisenhower, as much as I do make the case that he certainly deserves to be in the top 10 of America's presidents from our whole skein of the presidency, I'm not going to make a case that Eisenhower made all the right calls, that he was perfect. No leader makes all the right calls. And I'll just cite a couple of examples, and we could expand on this if need be. He wasn't as sensitive to the plight of African Americans and the everyday indignities that they faced in this country as he could have been. He did the right thing. Bruce may refer to the civil rights measure in that regard, and that was the right thing. But in terms of appreciating what African Americans were dealing with north and south in this country, that was not there. And in that way, he was a creature of his own upbringing in Kansas in the late 19th, early 20th century, and of course his military career surrounded by Southerners and their mentality on the issue of race. You're probably more familiar with the fact that Eisenhower overthrew democratically elected governments in the Third World, as in Guatemala, attempted to do so in Indonesia. That was a flop, was successful in throwing out Mossadegh in Iran. Historians have amply and sharply and probably justifiably criticized some of these moves. Eisenhower, if he were sitting next to me, would say, Birkner, if you were sitting where I was sitting, you'd have done the same thing. I don't think he ever had any great regrets about that. But overall, and of course, he made the U-2 judgment. Now, you can blame the CIA for it because they're the ones who told him to do it, but he was the guy who had to make the call. And that last call in May of 1960 blew up any chances of a true thaw in the Cold War. Overall, this is a guy who deserves high marks. One of the things I have not talked about is how effective a person he was in terms of his relations with Congress, and fortunately we have Bruce to talk about that. Let me close this with an extract from a letter that Eisenhower wrote to a former World War II colleague, a man by the name of William Phillips. A living democracy, Eisenhower wrote, needs to have diversities brought together in a common purpose. A common purpose that is so fair and so reasonable and so appealing that all can rally to it. That was Eisenhower, and I think we're lucky to have had him. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Can you guys hear me out there? Let me start by saying how intimidating it is to be on a panel with Michael about Eisenhower. So I'm going to quickly turn this to something I know about, which is Congress. But I will talk a little bit about Congress's legislative record under Eisenhower as president. And that's tough, right? Because think about it, Eisenhower was sandwiched in between these two periods of whirlwind legislative activity, right? We're talking about FDR's New Deal and also about Johnson's Great Society. And of course, yes, I'm ignoring Truman's less successful fair deal here and Kennedy's mostly stalled legislative agenda. So it has a reputation of being a kind of sleepy period legislatively. And if you look, I'm going to put a couple of graphs up here because I'm a political scientist and we love to count things. So let's see if this works. There we go. So right, if you look, this is David Mayhew, who writes, who does a lot of analysis, actually qualitative analysis. He's gone through history and he tries to identify in each Congress major laws that were passed. And so to some extent, Eisenhower's, these are the number of major laws in each Congress. So if you look at 1953 to 1960 there, you know, it's sort of a low point, but really it's mostly similar. What's exceptional are the Great Society years and actually moving into the early 1970s as well. So that's one way to do it, right? You can count laws. But I think we need to look more at the quality of legislation and at the kinds of things presidents have done as well. And Eisenhower has actually, if you look at it, quite a long list of legislative accomplishments, or at least Congress under Eisenhower. I tried to fit them on one page, so I left out a bunch of things. But these are some of the major laws passed by Congress under Eisenhower. And I'm going to call your attention first to the votes on each side. First of all, we don't see votes like this in Congress much anymore, right? And it's not just that Congress is more polarized right now. It's like, this isn't accidental, right? Eisenhower knew what he could do in Congress, right? Good presidents understand what agendas can pass and what you can bring Democrats and Republicans together on. And I think he was particularly good at that. A voice vote, by the way, is a vote on legislation that's, you know, so there's so much consensus on that, no one even wants to count the votes, okay? And so you just don't see this in Congress anymore. Certainly in the Senate, there were some close things there, but for the most part, these are, this is consensus legislation here. Mayhew talks about this in terms that most of this legislation was focused on things like economic growth and productivity and scientific advancement. And a couple of the pieces of legislation, which I think are really important, were actually deadlocked in Congress from prior Congresses. Things like the National Science Foundation, which Congress couldn't agree on how to structure it. And also the highway program. The big hitch there was funding. Now, that was floating around Congress for a long time, and it moved through under Eisenhower with the development of the Highway Trust Fund for that. These were big laws. A lot of them were big. Liberals won't like some of them, but they were big laws. The Submerged Lands Act and the Outer Continental Shelf Act were, Mayhew says, the kind of drill, baby drill acts of his time. The Agricultural Act of 1954 made price supports more efficient. The Revenue Act of 1954 was a huge tax overhaul. The Upper Colorado Storage Project, that was a gigantic bill that brought power, irrigation, flood control to lots of western states. The Agricultural Act of 1958, another move away from crop subsidies. NASA, we know that, a response to Sputnik. And the Interstate Highway Act, of course. Again, huge accomplishment legislatively. And I think this list could include other acts as well. Mayhew doesn't include these on his list, but things like the Social Security increase by 7% that happened in, I believe, 1958. You had the Civil Rights Act in 1957. You had a minimum wage increase, and you had the Department of Defense reorganization. So this is not a slouchy legislative record, especially when you consider that for, let's see, 3 of the 4 Congresses under Eisenhower's term, there was divided control. In other words, the Democrats held both the House and the Senate. The only time that wasn't true was his first session of Congress after his election, where Republicans held the House. So, can we take some lessons from this? Well, Congress is so different today, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, and the country is so different, right? There was the 1950s time of relative consensus in internationalism, and again, that's especially true if we're going to ignore the millions of disenfranchised African Americans, right? But even on civil rights, we're making at least some strides. Some of the fundamentals for presidents still matter in terms of success with Congress. So, for example, if you win a compelling and convincing victory, right? Both of Eisenhower's victories over Adlai Stevenson were big. He won, was the 55 to 44 in the 1952 election, and then 57 to 42% in the 1956 election. We don't actually see presidential elections with those sorts of kind of landslides anymore, and so that makes it harder for presidents to be successful with Congress. Unified government in the House and the Senate makes it easier, but again, Eisenhower chose his agenda in a way where he could get Democrat buy-in on a lot of these issues. A good sense of timing is key, right? A great example of that is Johnson honoring Kennedy's legacy. Economic growth helps. A manageable agenda helps. Jimmy Carter overloaded Congress with so many things, Congress didn't know what to do with them all. And as a result, even though he had both houses of Congress controlled by Democrats, Carter didn't do much. And of course, you know, maintaining good relationships with members. Obama was criticized for being too aloof with members. He didn't want to socialize with members. And that kind of thing actually pays off, right? We know that Reagan would often go out for drinks with Tip O'Neill and so on, and we don't see that in Washington anymore. I'm sure not many members of Congress are socializing with Trump, although some do. So let's talk about how Congress has changed for a few minutes, and then we'll talk. I'll hand it over to Annie. But Congress is a very, very different institution now than it was, obviously. I think the number one thing that we have to talk about is partisan polarization. So what you had in 1965, right, 65 Voting Rights Act set off a process whereby white Southern conservative Democrats headed for the exit doors of the Democratic Party and gradually joined the Republican Party. These were really conservative members, in some cases far more conservative than Republicans. I think about people like Harry Byrd in Virginia, right? And meanwhile, and so they joined with Republicans in making the Republican Party far more uniformly conservative. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, you had millions of newly enfranchised African American voters coming into the Democratic Party, making it more uniformly liberal. And so this process plays out over 30 to 40 years, right? And it brings us to where we are right now with an extremely polarized party system. Much more difficult under divided government, right? If you're somebody like Trump, you have a much more difficult time finding moderates in the opposition party even to work with than was true when Ike was president. There's also a much closer balance of control in Congress right now. In any given Congress, the House or the Senate could swing either way. And what that does is it gets the parties to focus more on messaging than on serious legislating. One example of this are the 59 times the Republican Party put an Obamacare repeal on the floor during Obama's presidency when it was clear that he would not sign that, right? Those were message votes. They weren't attempts to sort of fix the legislation or so on. And Democrats do the same thing. You have a lot more centralization of power now in Congress. It used to be a president like Ike could talk to a few key committee chairs and work with those members. Everything now goes through the party leadership, and the party leadership is concerned about winning the majority back. And so they're concerned a lot more with politics than they are with policy. Certainly policy matters, but probably not as much. You can't ignore fundraising. Members of Congress are now engaged in relentless fundraising. Elections have become really expensive, and it really takes crucial time away from serious legislation and representation and oversight as well. And so it means that members just have less time to actually deal with the nuts and bolts of legislation. And that makes it easier even to, more difficult even for presidents to think about building coalitions within Congress. And I will add that that problem has been exacerbated by the court's decision in Citizens United, which has allowed outside money to pour into congressional campaigns and pressured members to spend even more time raising money to protect themselves. So we have a kind of permanent campaigning Congress now that we didn't have when Ike was president. And I think I'll close with two more points. The media environment, as Brendan and Michael both alluded to, is just completely different right now. There was no Twitter, right, or 24-hour news programs. And we laugh, but that's serious, right, because this kind of social media allows even freshman members of Congress, and I'm thinking about Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez here, to build national constituencies independent of their party and even of the president. So if you're a president now, you need to contend with these members. These members just didn't have that kind of national visibility in the time before social media. And so that's serious. And the last thing I want to say is that members, and this is not really quantifiable, but members are just different now. Barbara Sinclair, who's a tremendous congressional scholar who actually just passed away last year, one of the best ever, I think nails it in characterizing the typical senator from the 50s and 1990s and currently. So I'm going to see if I can flash this up here. Sorry, that was fundraising. We're going to go past the fundraising. Sorry. Here we go. I think these are great characterizations of how Congress has changed. So in the 1950s, a typical senator was a courtly older gentleman, probably a Southern Democrat, perhaps even a white-haired and clad in a white linen suits, working in a committee behind closed doors. 1970s to 90s, the typical senator, a policy entrepreneur, a Democrat, Republican, liberal, or conservative, pursuing his cause, very issue-oriented, right, singly with a few allies on the Senate floor. And in 2000s, you have, senators are partisan warriors, right? They're acting as members of party teams. They're dueling with opposing party counterparts in the public arena, and they use all the procedural and public relations tools available to them. This kind of senator and this kind of House member is a lot more difficult to get in a room and carve out compromises on legislation with. Very, very different institutions right now, and it's a real challenge for presidential leadership. Now that said, and I'm going to end here, one of Mayhew's points was that several of the pieces of legislation that were passed during Ike's presidency had been stuck in Congress for a long time. So it'd be really interesting to see some research on what he did to kind of pull them out and what his role was in bringing, especially the National Science Foundation and the Highway Trust Act. What kind of leadership helped extract these from Congress and put together some compromises that could actually move through two major pieces of legislation? That would be a great study. I don't know if anybody's done it. Michael, you might know. Oh, it has been done. Okay. This is why it's intimidating serving with Michael. I'll stop there and turn it over to Annie.
Good morning. So through my work with the Women in Leadership program at the Eisenhower Institute, I often get asked, what does President Eisenhower have to do with women in leadership? And at first I was like, I don't have a good answer to that question. I felt like I should come up with a good answer to that question. So I started looking into a little bit of the history of women who surrounded him, and in particularly I started at the beginning when he was running for president the first time. And it turns out, actually, that he had a pretty good legacy. He appointed more women to high-level positions than any president before him. He was the first Republican and the second president to ever have a female in his cabinet. He was really good about women in the judiciary. And so I had this sense from getting those stats that he might have actually been more open-minded than I had sort of been initially inclined to believe. So then I started reading some of his speeches, and a few of his quotes are, to borrow a phrase from the students, a little cringy. They're taken out of context in particular. They don't sound great, but taken in context, they're actually reasonable, a lot of them. And so what I did is I started collecting stories of some of the women who surrounded him. And to borrow or to sort of paraphrase one of his definitions of leadership, that the art of leadership is getting other people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. I found 3 women in particular who did exactly that. They wanted him to run for president, and at first he wasn't super excited about that prospect. And so I'll start with Jacqueline Cochran. She, those of you who have studied him know that she's the one who flew over to Paris and delivered reels of the rally at Madison Square Garden that sort of, some attribute that to being the reason that he decided to finally run. Well, she's this really cool woman. She was born into abject poverty in the Deep South. At 6 years old, went to work in a cotton mill. At 14, she was married. 15, she was a mom. 19, her son died. 21, she's divorced. She moves to New York, changes her name, starts over, goes to flight school, becomes the first woman to break the sound barrier, and this like super famous racing pilot. So at the same time, she also gets really interested in politics. She runs, never elected. Actually, all 3 of these women all ran, I think, total of 12 times. No one ever got elected, but they got really close. And they were working within the Republican Party to, excuse me, to try to advance women's interests. So Jacqueline gets together with some folks, and they go to Madison Square Garden. They have, actually, they were even talking about crowd size back then. They were like, 15,000 people, in standing room only, people waiting in the streets to try to get into Madison Square Garden. But this was actually true, and they documented it with these reels. Well, she flies over, and she meets the president, soon-to-be president, and shows him these videos, and he's really touched. And she then follows it up with a letter to him saying, thank you so much for hosting me, letting me show you these reels. I hope you can sense how important this is to us. And she, for the first time of many, uses the phrase, I truly believe you will be our second Lincoln. And so she develops this little buzz phrase that then gets repeated over and over again. And she comes back. She also then works with some other folks, and I think somehow interacts with Vivian Callums, the next one I'll talk about, and they do that Disney cartoon. They get in touch with Disney and do the I Like Ike Disney segment that then runs. I mean, can you imagine that happening today? But she's all behind this letter writing campaign, and it's, to me, fairly indicative of what in our women in leadership students back there talk about collaborative and transformational leadership, that she's not leading from the front. She's sort of leading gathering. She's doing this collaborative style of rallying people behind him, coming up with catchy phrases, using media in an incredibly savvy way to accomplish what she wants and to convince him to do what she wants, which is to run for president. About the same time, Vivian Callums is this woman who, I think she's from Connecticut. She is a huge anti-income tax person. That's her thing. She's also incredibly wealthy in her own right. And so she develops this TV show called The Power of Woman. And it only runs from July to November, leading up to the election. But she writes to the candidate Eisenhower and says, so if you're elected, what are you going to do about women? Are you going to appoint women to your cabinet? And he says, very politically, I will seek out the best women or best people I can, and I'm sure I will have to include women because, of course, their perspective is vital and so on and so forth. And he doesn't commit at all to including women in his cabinet, but he did. But so then she says, well, I would like to be able to tell my viewers that you are actually interested in promoting the interests of women. And she does that. And for about 6 months in this TV show, most of the content of it is lost, but the sort of reviews of it talk about how she was pushing women towards agenda issues that were consistent with President Eisenhower's agenda. Then the show, Election Day happens and the show goes away. So it was so pretty obvious to me that that was part of her reason for doing the show. And then there's Ellen Harris, and she was better known as Mrs. J. Ramsey Harris. She was, I'm putting on the glasses because she was the National Citizens for Eisenhower Congressional Committee leader. And she drafted this memo that I brought, and I didn't know how many people we'd have, but I can circulate it if you want to see it. She writes this memo to the head of Mr. Murphy, the head of the campaign, and goes on in great detail about about women and voting behavior, and points out that more women voted for Eisenhower than Stevenson in the first one, and as we go into the midterms, that's what she was worried about, that they really need to come up with a targeted message, that Eisenhower needs to focus on women and women's issues, and goes on to explain not just because of sort of domestic things, but the interest of women in peace, and that was one of the big agenda items. So she writes this memo, I'm trying to find the sort of cool quote, convincing him that, like, for example, there are some 19 million women members in the labor force, goes on about labor. Well, this memo is then co-opted and becomes the confidential memo to the campaign, saying we need to do this, and we need to target women in the coming election. And the quote is, so it's Murphy forwards it on and says to all the people, Clifford Roberts and the rest, and says, the statistics set out in Mrs. Harris's memorandum reveal that women constitute over 50% of the total vote in 32 states and control 70% of the wealth of the United States. This seems to reveal one of the richest and least exploited veins in the mind of the American electorate. I don't know if he would want the word exploited to be used, but if you take that as a more neutral term and say an opportunity to identify a new untapped resource within the electorate, Mrs. Harris, Ellen Harris's memo went on to become the foundation for the strategy in 54 and 56, and then in 56, President Eisenhower and Mamie Eisenhower start these listening tours, what we would call today, and they assemble panels of women. And it is documented, I don't know if it's true or not, but it was said that they were unscripted and that he didn't know the questions in advance. But they recorded these and then broadcast them and then actually republished some of the quotes in the women's sections of the newspapers. And then he attributes this effort towards women for why he comes to understand the need for educating women and why the women are so critical to the future of democracy. He does in the speech, the big speech he gives about that, he does say partly the reason we need to educate women is because they're mothers and that they're raising the next generation of voters, which, you know, makes some people uncomfortable, but it's also true. I mean, that was what the culture was, particularly at the time. And so he understood that. And that, to me, now makes me more able to explain why Women in Leadership, the program, is at the Eisenhower Institute. Because no, he was not a raging feminist. He is not known for his feminist agenda, but he was rational, he was moderate, he was open-minded, and he took this perspective from these women, many, many more, I'm still collecting their stories, and allowed himself to be persuaded to take a different approach than he might have otherwise if these women hadn't been involved in his life. Thanks.
So we have time now for some questions and interaction with you all from the panel. I think what we'll do, I don't see microphones out there, so if you can keep your questions short so that my small brain can repeat them for the whole audience, and then we'll have the panelists answer. Yes, sir.
Bruce, I'll start with you, but I invite anybody in front of us to answer. Watching the news or anything on TV today, it just becomes so damn disheartening about this polarization. And I remember the ordeal of Ronald Reagan having bourbon or whatever it was after hours. Couple questions. Even if we had a president who had the inclination to want to do that and the skill to do it, would it even be possible? I mean, I get very depressed about, can we relive those days where the people talk to each other? And if they do, they screw each other. Can it happen?
So the question is, in the current environment, even if there were a president who were inclined to and had the ability to overcome the polarization, would he be able to work with Congress to do that? Bruce.
Thanks for the easy question. It's a great question. I think, obviously, you know, presidential leadership can make a difference. You can have an agenda that's not dividing, but it's a tough road. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is how we nominate presidents. And that's what makes some of the polarization more difficult here. So if you go back to 1968, it's really instructive, right? Hubert Humphrey won the nomination of the Democratic Party without entering a single primary. That's pretty amazing. Why? Because party leaders at the convention had control over delegates, and they decided who the nominees were going to be. There were significant reforms to the nomination system in 1972, and thereafter, mostly in the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party followed it. And what you have now are people, for the most part, nominating presidents through primary elections and the Iowa caucuses and things like that. Here's the thing about primaries. Primaries are not a random selection of voters. And there's great evidence on this. The voters who come out in primaries are far more politically extreme than the general electorate. So what we get are candidates playing to voter bases, right, to win primary elections. And this process yields two candidates that are typically really far apart because they've gotten through this primary season that rewards, if anything, policy and ideologies on the extremes. So I think, and we're not moving in that direction, I think one of the ways that maybe we could fix this is by making some changes to the primary system. Although, again, some of these changes are structural in the country. I don't want to go on and on about this. There's some great research out there right now that what started out as policy divisions, and Robin, we've talked about this, have become divisions, what political scientists call affective polarization. In other words, Democrats just don't like Republicans anymore, and vice versa. This isn't about policy anymore. And actually, with policy, it's a lot easier to bring people to the middle. If you just plain don't like the other side, that's a more difficult thing to bring back, to rein in. So I wish I could be more optimistic. I get up every day thinking I'm going to be optimistic, and then I go to the news. And then I switch it off. And I look to my students, some of whom are here. We're relying on you guys. That's the best I can do with that, but it's a great question. And it's really the key question. I will pass it on to other people.
We have more questions, so I'll let people know.
Over here, to the left.
Hi there, thank you. I wanted to, I'm not sure who on the panel can best answer this, but I wanted to ask about a question of Eisenhower's leadership that seems to be pertinent to today, because Eisenhower was facing a wildly popular demagogue, Joe McCarthy, who was viciously attacking people close to Eisenhower and in his own administration and Eisenhower himself. And yet Eisenhower, for the longest time, exhibited a level of forbearance that even drove some of his closest associates crazy toward McCarthy, while at the same time figuring out ways to sort of undo McCarthy. And here we are, possibly in an era where there's a similar situation, and wondering what Eisenhower has to teach us about that from the way he handled that situation.
Yeah. Well, it's a good
Great question.
It's a good question. The only thing I would take issue with you on in the question is that Joe McCarthy was never wildly popular. Even at his peak of influence, he had the support of 35 or 40% of the population, and that went down very rapidly as people got more exposed to him in 1954 with the hearings. That said, he was an influential figure and a person who was in effect domineering and in effect also harming Eisenhower's ability to get the legislative agenda he wanted through in 1953 and 54. This is a complex issue. It's been actually written about quite a bit. I've written an article about it for a national journal called Prologue, and David Nichols has more recently written a very fine book called Ike and Joe McCarthy. To give you the short version here, Eisenhower appeased McCarthy in 53 because he was persuaded that McCarthy, being a Republican, would play to his base but ultimately play ball with the administration in its legislative needs. And he used Richard Nixon as his conduit to McCarthy because Nixon had his own anti-communist credentials, as you know. And Nixon took McCarthy out to dinner on a regular basis, and they would sort of talk it through, and Nixon would say, Joe, play nice, etc. And McCarthy would say he would, and then the next day he'd generate a new headline attacking the administration for being soft on communism. What happens is that at the end of 1953, Eisenhower and his closest aides, Herbert Bernal, Sherman Adams in particular, make a conclusion that there was no dealing with McCarthy. But Eisenhower does not want to split his party. Remember, McCarthy had a following. Almost half of the Republican senators were McCarthy supporters, including William Noland of California, who would become the Senate Majority Leader when Robert Taft died in the summer of '53. So what they decide they're going to do is kneecap McCarthy, but they're going to do it behind the scenes. And this has been documented in a variety of books, Nichols' book, Fred Greenstein's book, The Hidden Hand Presidency. And what Eisenhower does is he uses influence behind the scenes to essentially force McCarthy to have these public hearings where the public would recognize what he was. And McCarthy's strength with any electorate, except for the diehard right-wingers, really dissipated, after Joe Welsh gave his line about "have you no decency, sir?" So I would just simply refer you to the good scholarship. I would say I would be happy to talk with you further, but fundamentally Eisenhower accomplished his goal in '54 after being a little bit too forbearing with McCarthy in '53. Here's the kicker to it, though. Your fundamental point is a very valid one. Eisenhower, by doing it the way he did it, did not push McCarthy off the scene before a lot of damage was done to innocent people in '53 and '54. People in the Foreign Service, people in the Defense and State Department who were kicked out of office on the basis of rumors and innuendo that they were either homosexual or had drinking problems or whatever it was. And scholars have talked about that. There's a great book called The Lavender Scare by David Johnson. I would not give Eisenhower a pass on McCarthy, but I think on balance I would say he did the best he could with the cards he had to play.
Can I just add to that? One small point in that is I often think, what would Joe McCarthy have been like with a Twitter account? And then how much more difficult, and I say that in all seriousness, and that would change the calculus of having to deal with him. And I'm not sure how he would have, so.
This one's for Michael. How you doing, Michael?
Hi, David.
I want to switch to foreign policy. You mentioned one thing, Michael, that I completely agree with you on. He kind of dropped the ball when it came to rather glibly overthrowing some countries. The other thing I'd give him a good marks on was continuing what we would have called the bipartisan foreign policy that was begun by Franklin Roosevelt, really cemented by Harry Truman, has really lasted up until, well, what was it, last week or whatever it was, the last 70 years, we've had really an excellent relationship with European powers, which is very different from what we've had in American history to that point. But the other flip side of it is not so good on the basic paradigm of that period, which was, to them, it's all about communism and free world, and they missed the whole anti-colonialism thing. And, look at Vietnam, look at a lot of these other things that you mentioned. Your comments, please, Michael.
I'll be very brief because I think you've said it very well. I guess I'd put it this way. For Eisenhower, the Cold War was a struggle that was, in effect, a zero-sum game. So every time the communists gained any turf or any leverage, we were losing turf or leverage, and that was the mentality. The Eisenhower administration even had difficulty accepting the fact that someone like Nehru in India wanted to plot a middle way between the two superpowers. And Eisenhower really, in the end, did get converted to that after meeting with Nehru here in Gettysburg and spending 2 days talking it out with Nehru. And he had a hard time convincing his Secretary of State that neutralism was okay, but he did sort of come around to that. So I'll just simply say your point is very well taken. I don't think this was the strongest suit of the Eisenhower administration, but it was also part of the mentality of the Democratic Party as much as it was of the Republican Party. You've got to remember that Eisenhower was considered vulnerable in the latter part of his presidency by being too soft and being too lazy and being too much outpaced by what Nikita Khrushchev was allegedly doing. Now, we weren't being outpaced, but that was, in effect, the litany of leading Democrats like Stuart Symington, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson himself. But I think your premise is just basically right.
It's a privilege to listen to each of you. Thank you for being here today. Following up these last two questions, and from a legislative and a leadership and a policy perspective, how do you think the Cold War focused or channeled or suppressed or motivated the administration? Did it control the legislative agenda? Did it limit it from a leadership standpoint, also with regard to appointments and his policies on women. Did it affect, did it not affect, how did it affect?
Well, I've been talking a lot, so if anybody else wants it.
You're the one to go on this. I would only say, from a legislative perspective, I mean, I think the Cold War had, it's hard to untangle this from the way the party system was constructed back then, where Democrats, you know, had a large contingent of very southern, very conservative Democrats. You know, people, most Democrats in the South were moderate to conservative, and I think the effect of the Cold War was you know, to sort of, if nothing else, maybe put off some more divisive issues, right? I mean, it's interesting that when the Cold War is over in 1992, we see this major polarization after Clinton and Newt Gingrich, right? It happens then, and I often think that can't be a coincidence, right? Something, yeah, there's something there where it sort of unraveled the kind of political world and coalitions that we were kind of living in, and I think it allowed on the agenda issues that, domestic issues that were much more divisive in some ways under Clinton. And you had people like Newt Gingrich come to power as well, ready to exploit those things. So I don't know, this is a vague answer to a good question.
No,
So I'm going to pass it on to Michael.
I think it's a good answer. I do think that the environment in the 1950s was a consensus environment against the communists, and we were going to do what we needed to do to preserve our freedoms and our democratic institutions. Let me take your question, John, and move it into the realm of what this panel is about, which is Eisenhower's leadership. And I want to just give an example of this. There's fighting the Cold War and there's fighting the Cold War. Eisenhower was part of the establishment that helped Harry Truman design containment, but Eisenhower was frustrated by Harry Truman's approach, which he thought was entirely reactive, and which Eisenhower also believed was a case in terms of spending, of just throwing money here, throwing money there. The worst example being NSC 68, which suggested this year of maximum danger in the Cold War, and throwing $90 billion, which is real money in 1950, at the issue of defense. Eisenhower comes in as president, and he says, we're going to do things differently. We're going to figure out how to have an efficient defense establishment, and we're going to fight the Cold War, not just effectively in terms of containing the Russians, but we're also going to use psychological warfare, which is a very broad umbrella of activities on our part. We're going to use psychological warfare, and we're going to use alliances to actually push the Soviets onto the strong defense. What he does in '53 is really remarkable. He calls together the smartest people in the United States in the issue of defense and security, and he creates something called Project Solarium, in which they meet in a particular room in the White House for several months. He includes Democrats in that group, George Kennan being a prominent example. And he then gives them a task. He says, this group will do rollback of the Soviets. This group will continue the Truman policy of containment, but add a new dimension of it, which involves higher technology, missiles and such. And the third group will just stay where we are. And they talk it out. They meet him in the solarium room. And Eisenhower, after they make their presentations, summarizes what he thinks was going on. It's very interesting because in his memoirs, George Kennan says, Eisenhower showed his intellectual supremacy over every person in that room. And George Kennan was no, slouch. That's an interesting thing. And it did lead Eisenhower to change the nature of our Cold War focus, moving boots on the ground to a lower priority, getting more technology, more missile development, and also, again, emphasizing psych warfare, which he used quite effectively over the course of his 8 years. To me, that's leadership, and it's one of the high points of his presidency. We haven't had anything quite like it since.
So my sense in terms of the impact or influence of the Cold War in women in leadership, or just reading between the lines, I feel like they were somewhat unrelated. Most of his appointments of women were to domestic policy arenas. He did appoint several women to ambassadorships, and he was under him was the first female to a major European country ambassador, to Italy, I think it was. But my sense is about women in leadership and women in his position is that he was trying to get whoever would fill the position best, sort of gender being a secondary consideration. And as the focus was on the Cold War and then, of course, on the civil rights and Arkansas and everything else, that the women's movement sort of was able to gather itself, maybe gather steam, and you don't see it burst forth. It's almost like the second wave feminism coming in 1960 came out of nowhere. And people write about it like, oh my gosh, this just happened, but it didn't just happen. And so my sense is that the focus was over here on Cold War concerns and civil rights concerns, but he allowed and encouraged women in positions to slowly sort of migrate towards the top.
So I just want to add one thing and run the risk of being wrong and having Professor Birkner tell me I'm wrong. The other thing that strikes me about the time frame you're talking about is, right, we clearly, Eisenhower and others at the time viewed the Soviet Union not immediately, but certainly sort of overarching as an existential threat. The thing that I'm struck by at that time, both in terms of his leadership, but also in terms of the change in Congress, is this wasn't the only thing we got done at the time. So it wasn't the only legislative, right? There was lots of legislation that passed, largely coming out of a committee system. And so the fact that Washington could do more than one thing at one time is different than today.
They were doing less fundraising, no doubt. Not to harp on that, but
curious about Eisenhower's background as a military leader, how that informed his presidency, and the lack of military experience by the last several presidents, and whether you think that's been a big effect. And maybe I'll point to you, Ann, and ask, aren't women better at dealing with children than men? And what's really interesting, though, there's some extremely excellent women with military background, and whether you think that is the right combination for leadership today.
So the question is, do I think that military leadership is a good quality in a leader in terms of?
Well, I was first interested whether you all, if there's any opinion, whether Eisenhower, because he was a military man, was a better leader.
Absolutely.
And then, of the up-and-coming potential women leaders, do you think the ones with a military background are better than the ones without the military background, or is it not really a defining issue?
My personal opinion is that military experience is invaluable to leadership, and particularly trying to lead at the federal level, and that women with military experience in the modern era are going to have a different perspective. And of course, there weren't any significant women in the military leadership at the time that in Eisenhower's leadership chain. But in the present, yes, I think that it would be beneficial for women with military experience or for women leaders to have military experience.
But is that going to make a difference? Are we going to be able to control Congress or move anything forward?
can I point at something? It's also important to have military experience in Congress. And if you look at the data, I was just showing my class's data, the number of members, the percentage of members with military background has dropped precipitously over the past several decades. And it's really low right now. In this 2018 election, there were some members elected, including several women members with military experience. Mickey Sherrill, for example, Mikey Sherrill from New Jersey. That's really important. You remember, Congress deals with tons of military and defense issues, and you just need that perspective in Congress. And increasingly, we don't have it. And increasingly, we also don't have it with presidents. So we're being led, our military policy making and so on, are being led by people without much experience. And certainly there's information, and members and presidents can get information, but the experience isn't there. And I think we're worse off for it, actually.
I'm just going to be very brief because we're running out of time. I can't answer Joe's question. I think that what Annie and Bruce said is very, very real and thoughtful. I would say just quickly on Eisenhower as a president side, of course he's informed by the lifelong experience in the military, and it mostly has very positive emphasis, particularly for him, particularly in terms of his organizational focus and going through chains of command and making sure that you learn how to delegate, you learn how to let the tough decisions go to the very top. And I think people tend to exaggerate, or in the past tended to exaggerate, the degree to which he transferred exactly what he was doing in the military as president. He did not. He was really fascinated by the British Secretariat. That was as much an influence on him as anything that he had in terms of organizational structures. But the life experiences he had managing people like Montgomery and Patton, tell me that didn't affect his managing McCarthy. And I think I'll leave it at that.
We have time for one last question, perhaps, and then we will make room for the next panel. Anybody dying to get one last question out? Well, seeing none from the floor, thank you all again for being here. Thank you to the panel.